Dr. Alika is the professor in the Department of Anatomy, Biochemistry, and Physiology at the John A. Burns School of Medicine from the University of Hawaii. His talk will be Understanding the Biological Basis of Health Disparities in Native Hawaiians to Enable Prevention. So everyone, strong applause for Dr. Alika.
Oh, aloha mai kako. Warm greetings from Hawaii. I'm very honored to be part of this conference and very grateful for this opportunity to share with all of you and to learn from all of you. Spent a wonderful 2 days learning a lot about what you do in the community, all the great work, and I'm so grateful and honored to be here. I kind of want to echo Valerie that she mentioned the other day, that this conference feels like we're in community, at home, and that's such a special feeling. I can tell you the conferences I've been to in my field definitely don't feel that way, so this is just amazing. I also want to thank some of my fellow Kanaka from Hawaii and from the continent that traveled here to be here today. Mahalo ya oko for representing our lahui. Thanks for joining us here. So you might think, looking at the title, so I'm not a nutritionist. What am I doing here at a nutrition conference? So I study the other things, different perspective of nutrition, what happens after you eat, what happens to our cells and molecules at that level to respond and interact with each other to enable health. And so I hope that I make that a little clear during my talk, what that looks like and why we do this. But before I begin, I'd like to take some time to recognize and acknowledge the hardships that our community has recently faced with the wildfires on Maui. We think of them all the time and pray for them. I'd like to share a pule, or a prayer, that my great-grandmother wrote. She's actually originally from Kula, Maui, that was impacted by the wildfires. And I also like to extend this prayer to all of our communities, our indigenous families across the nation, that will bless them with good health. So please join me in this pule, however you feel comfortable. E pule kako. O kama ko haku ho'omaikai mai oi me ke aloha no kama ko olakino me ko makana no keia la a me na la mawa'e. Amen. Amen. Thank you. I want to also acknowledge and take a moment to say what I think my great-grandmother would say in this moment. Despite all the tragedies that's happening, and this is obviously really hard for people to go through right now, I believe that she would acknowledge that this is an unfortunate symptom of what happens when you take native peoples and remove them away from their ancestral lands. And so I think we all recognize that here today, and how we can restore that connectivity and that connection and that ecosystem in our communities to enable the health and well-being for all the flora and fauna within that ecosystem, including our Kanaka, our people. And this brings me, as Matt mentioned the other day, we are far from any other land around us. You can see we're about 2,500 miles away from the California coast. But despite this, we remain very vibrant and have a population that sustained us for many years. You might recognize us by some of our stereotypes, like Matt mentioned, about pineapples and hula and maybe Lilo and Stitch if you're a Disney fan. But we're really more than these stereotypes from a 1960s postcard. As maybe some of you don't know, Hawaii, we do have snow in the winter. It's on the mountain called Maunakea. Yes, that's my last name, and I can go into how that originated. That's probably take another 30 minutes to talk about, but we can talk about that later if you're interested. But just suffice to say, my family has really strong and deep roots in Hawaii, going back many, many hundreds of years. Now, this is probably one of the few places in the world where you can actually go snowboarding and surfing on the same day if you really wanted to. I'm not that adventurous. And I'm definitely not brave enough to do what this lady is doing. I don't know, sometimes I question whether that has anything to do with the low oxygen levels up in the mountain. So Matt mentioned this the other day, so I'm not going to go too much in detail, but Native Hawaiians of today are descendants of ancient Polynesians that migrated out of Southeast Asia. and navigated the Pacific. No, we didn't arrive unintentionally on a raft and just drifted to Hawaii. We actually settled Hawaii and navigated the oceans on a double-hulled canoe using sophisticated technologies and knowledge that was developed by our ancestors. We settled Hawaii around 300 AD and developed a very sophisticated society that was completely self-sufficient and sustainable, albeit isolated for thousands of years. The first contact from the Western world was made by Captain James Cook of the British Empire. It was he who actually gifted King Kamehameha the Great the British flag, and who used it for the Hawaiian government's flag. And that's why you see, this British Jack appear on the Hawaiian state flag today. In 1810, Kamehameha united the Hawaiian Islands, and his dynasty later adopted a constitutional monarchy that was modeled after the UK. Hawaii remained an independent, internationally recognized sovereign nation for nearly 100 years before the kingdom was forcibly overthrown and illegally annexed by the United States at the turn of the century, and later became the state that you know today. So over this rapidly changing period, the native Hawaiian population suffered a steep crash in population. So largely due to introduced infectious diseases. Matt mentioned this the other day as well, to the point that we actually almost went extinct. In the 1900s, were about as many as 40,000 individuals. Yet, due to the waves of immigration from Asia, Europe, and America, and interracial marriages, which were actually really commonplace at the time and is actually now more common than any other state today, the native Hawaiian population rebounded, as you can see here. And partly because of these interracial marriages, Hawaii's population overall actually is the most ethnically diverse state in the nation. This is from Census Data 2020, using what's called the Diversity Index. It measures a probability that any two people chosen at random from a population will be a different race and ethnic group. Hawaii also has a very unusual mix of population. We actually have the highest concentration, 70% of the state is comprised of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Many are multiracial, and there's no racial majority in the state. 21%, the population of 1.4 million are Native Hawaiian. Now, although Hawaii is quite diverse and admixed, our unique culture, foods, practices, philosophies, life ways, and language, some of which you've heard about in the past 2 days already, which were actually on the verge of collapse, experienced a sort of renaissance around the mid-1970s. And this was largely because of a few keepers of this knowledge that, despite really blatant efforts of oppression, passed this down to the next generation within their families and preserved that knowledge. Mine was one of the lucky families that was able to perpetuate this knowledge, which really affected my development and my education today. So this is a map, a heat map of the state to show where most of us live. The redder it is, the more dense the native Hawaiian population is on this map. And as you can see here, there are many clusters of red. Now, these are specific communities that restrict the lease of land from the government to native Hawaiians of full or half blood quantum. I was born and raised on one of these homesteads in this small town called Nanakuli. It's about 12,000 people. It's a beautiful landscape, as you can see here. And this is on the west side of Oahu, where again I was born and raised. This island also has the largest city of Honolulu. It's our capital city in Hawaii, depicted here. There's about 350,000 residents in Honolulu. And although the west side of Oahu, where I'm from, and Honolulu are really only separated by about 30 miles, takes about an hour drive, you can already see how different the built neighborhood environments are between the two areas, which factor into the long-standing health disparities our population suffers from, and I'll touch a little bit about that later in the talk today. So like I mentioned, I'm a product of the West Side, born and raised again in Nanakuli, but I did leave Hawaii for education to pursue my degrees from these institutions here, before eventually returning back to Hawaii at the university and the John A. Burns School of Medicine, where I run a lab that's really dedicated to giving back to the community that raised me. As I mentioned, I was immersed in Native Hawaiian culture, speaking Hawaiian as my first language. And it was just because of my great-grandmother, who was the matriarch in our family. It was a 4-generation household. We all lived together and learned from her. And she passed on her knowledge. She called it Nā mea Hawai'i, all things Hawaiian, to us. She was also a kahuna la'ulapa'au, which means a Hawaiian medicine healer. She would use things in the yard that she grew, the herbs that she would maintain, to take care of us. And so whenever we were sick, we would go to her, and the community would go to her for that. Now, she had this saying, and I really love this conference because everyone has examples that you've heard in the past few days presenting quotes from their family members, and I'd like to extend that tradition here and share one of mine from my great-grandmother. She had this quote that she liked to say. In Hawaiian, it's, "Nā huli kalima I luna, pololi ka opu. Nā huli kalima I lalo, piha ka opu." And that meant if you had your hands turned up like a beggar, you'll always be hungry. But if your hands were turned down towards the land, you'll be full. And she meant that as a way of telling us to take care of the land, or malama aina. Because for her, taking care of the land will help take care of you. So that really affected my upbringing and my understanding and my interest to understand more about how the environment around us, how the land actually can take care of us and impact our health. And that I fell into the field of epigenetics, which I'll explain a little bit later. You heard that in other talks as well, where it really is a mechanism we're now starting to understand that's enabling us to understand how the environment is impacting our health at the cell and molecular level. And so I hope I can touch a little bit on this today and share what that means and how we use that to understand how to prevent diseases in our community. Before I move on to that, I'd like to introduce some concepts or models of health and how we think about health. And I don't have to explain this ad nauseum with this audience because I think everyone here understands and appreciates this sort of holistic view of health, which I really appreciate. In Hawaiian, we call this the Nā Honui Mauliola, where personal individual health is actually attached to not just physical health, but emotional and mental health as well. That's in the context of our family and our community, as well as our built and natural environments around us. So it's really tied into everything. This is compatible with, but not exactly equivalent to the social ecologic model of health, which many of you might have heard about as well, where individual innate traits can be modified from peer support groups around you, as well as social influences in policy that can be impacted by historical factors. So it just gives us a really theory-based framework to understand how health is in its holistic picture, and not just one aspect of it. My lab focuses on one particular part of this holistic picture. It's at the cell and molecular level. We study how the gut microbiome and the bacteria in our gut actually relate to the epigenetic modifications of specific types of cells in our body, immune cells, that shape our metabolism, it shapes our immune response, and that really underlies a lot of the clinical conditions that we see, health as well as disease outcomes. I'm not going to explain all the technical details here. I'm always happy to talk about that on the side if you'd like to learn more about that. But we use what's called an integrative multi-omics approach to understand and address health disparities using multiple types of data, from the epigenome to metabolomics to microbiome, and incorporate that with clinical information, behavioral data, social and cultural and environmental data to really to start to really understand that holistic picture about health. And we do this to study many different health conditions, especially those conditions that disproportionately affect our communities. One of them is diabetes. And as you know, since 1994, the CDC declared diabetes as a national epidemic. And since then, as you can see by this slide, the prevalence has only grown and continued to rise throughout the country. Now, while of course a significant public health crisis overall, some ethnic groups that are shown here suffer from disproportionately higher rates of diabetes and younger age of onset of the disorder. Unfortunately, data from Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders from the CDC here tend to be aggregated with Asians, and that's in this dark blue line on the graph there. And it masks the striking differences we see in the subgroups in the Hawaii population, which I'll explain here. Now, Matt did a great job yesterday presenting some of this data, and I'm not going to go over it again, but I just wanted to say that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up about 1/4 of the state population, but their mortality due to diabetes is 3 times higher than that in any other population across the state. So the higher prevalence of diabetes, as well as also coincides with this earlier age onset of the disorder. We actually see in Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders individuals appearing at 10 years younger than the other populations for being diagnosed for diabetes. Now, why is this the case? We think that income and physical activity and obesity appear to be linked to this, but we're only starting to understand how race and ethnicity might determine social environments and experiences that actually impact gene function that underlie health throughout an individual's life. And I'm going to try to convince you that epigenetic mechanisms actually explain these interactions. Now, but before I mention that, I want to mention here that although epigenetics is a relatively new field in biology, the concept that environment, of course, impacts health is nothing new. We all know this. Native Hawaiians for centuries not only understood this concept, but applied it to their daily lives. And one example I'd like to share comes from our olelo no'eo, or wise sayings, like this one. Ipa'a ke kino o ke keiki i ka la'au. It means let the body of the child be solidly built by their herbal remedies. And this was said of kahuna la'o lapa'au practitioners, Hawaiian healers like Mai Kupuna, and that's depicted here, that would prescribe certain herbs in the diet of pregnant women, it was thought that the constituents of the herbs would help support healthy development of the child in utero. But the concept actually extended further, and it was thought that by doing so, this would help prevent adult onset disorders later in life for that child. So in some ways, I really think that we're relearning some of our ancient wisdom using modern tools. Now, getting back to these disparities I mentioned, an emerging ethnic difference we're starting to see from our data is that systemic levels of inflammation. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders seem to have a higher degree of that than any other population that's in Hawaii. We observe this high levels of inflammation, which seems to also be characteristic of diabetes. And in fact, it's linked to low socioeconomic status at the neighborhood level, as well as obesity. But what's the source of this ethnic difference in inflammation? Well, as I mentioned earlier, my lab focuses on understanding gene-environment interactions that underlie these conditions in our populations. And we study epigenetics, which sits at the interface between the social and environmental factors and drives normal development and health trajectories. So for those of you unfamiliar, epigenetics is the study of heritable changes in the phenotype, that's including diseases such as diabetes, that are not due to changes in the underlying DNA sequence. It literally means on top of genetics and explains, for example, how a single stem cell gives rise to hundreds of different cell types that make up your body, while the cells in your body have the same genetic sequence composition. So it's epigenetics that's really underlying that process. It's really fundamental to biology. And of course, while genetics plays a role in disease, it often it doesn't play as much role as other factors such as epigenetics and environmental factors. And in this case, there's estimates of upwards of 15% where genetic variability explains type 2 diabetes. So it doesn't explain all cases. One major epigenetic mechanism that we study is called DNA methylation, which is a chemical modification of specific cytosine bases that make up DNA but doesn't affect the sequence. So in normal development, DNA methylation patterns throughout the genome can be highly cell and tissue specific, which I found was also evolutionarily conserved across species. There's also significant variability of these tissue-specific DNA methylation patterns across individuals. Yet so far, it's unclear to what extent that DNA methylation variability actually accounts for race and ethnic disparities. Now, because of the cell type specificity, it's really important to study epigenetics at the cell level to better understand its functional relevance. Now, given the link between inflammation and diabetes, my lab focuses on studying epigenetics in monocytes. These are cells in your circulated system that it really plays a major role in inflammation. And depending on environmental factors, these cells can either adopt an inflammatory state, a pro-inflammatory state, which is related to insulin resistance and the progression of diabetes, or it can adopt an anti-inflammatory state, which is associated with a healthy metabolism. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Native Hawaiians seem to have a higher degree of inflammation than other groups. which relates to their higher prevalence of diabetes. So we're now pursuing a study to determine whether the variability of DNA methylation in these cells, in these monocytes, account for diabetes disparities, and we're measuring how much of that variability could be explained by upstream factors, social and environmental factors, using the multi-ethnic cohort study. This is the largest prospective cohort in the US to include Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders that was started in 1993. It covers 3 major ethnic groups in Hawaii, where importantly, blood cells were preserved over a 20-year period. And we took advantage of this unique resource to examine early indicators of diabetes before the clinical manifestation of the disease. Specifically, we identified individuals that's listed here that over 20 years developed diabetes and were clinically diagnosed with it. Now, in fact, you can see from this chart, in this cohort of over 12,000 people, Native Hawaiians and even Japanese Americans had a higher prevalence of diagnosed diabetes within that 20-year period, about 18 and 12% respectively, compared to what we see in whites, which is a fairly good representation of the population in Hawaii. Now, per each of these 3 ethnic groups, we selected 100 individuals that progressed to diabetes, so-called incident cases, and another 100 individuals that remained healthy or non-diabetic during that same time period, for a total of 600 individuals. We evaluated their immune and metabolic activity from biomarkers in plasma and carefully selected just the monocyte population from cryopreserved bloods to look at DNA methylation genome-wide. Now, I have to stress here, at this point in time, all the samples that we studied were from 20 years ago. This was before the onset of diabetes. So all these individuals are healthy or non-diabetic at the time. Despite that, we actually found and observed that those that would eventually become diabetic had higher levels of insulin resistance and even a higher proportion of these monocyte populations in their blood than their healthy counterpart controls. Now, in fact, if we split this data by ethnic group, we actually see that it's the Native Hawaiian group that's driving this higher level of insulin resistance and higher number of monocytes. So we're already starting to see what we call subclinical indicators of diabetes long before its clinical diagnosis is apparent in these ethnic groups. And we're trying to integrate this data to better understand the origins of this. But the first analysis was with using epigenetic profiling to look at what the methylation patterns look like in these cells. Now, this is unpublished data that we're putting together for a paper where we identified significant DNA methylation differences between individuals that eventually progressed to diabetes compared to those that remain diabetic over that 20-year time frame. This is what we call a heat map that shows differences where Native Hawaiians are separating clearly from the other 2 ethnic groups. The Native Hawaiian groups are under that green area there, as you can see. Each column in this image is an individual, and each row is the methylation state of a specific site in the genome, with the high levels of methylation being blue to low levels being red. And so we can detect a pattern of methylation at these sites throughout the genome that appear to indicate risk for diabetes. Again, this is before the onset, the clinical manifestation of the disease. So we can actually start to use this information for prevention, to enable prevention. So using a principal component analysis of this data, we found that the methylation variability, the methylation itself, actually explained 47% of the variance in the differences between the diabetic incident cases of diabetes and controls. And that's huge compared to what genetics can explain, upwards of best maybe of 15%. But what was really exciting to me personally was that we also found ethnic-specific differences in DNA methylation as depicted here. And the ethnic-specific differences were so profound that it already stratified individuals based on their ethnic groups, as you can see here. So Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are clustering in that green group there. Japanese Americans are clustering in the purple group, and whites in the pink group. And you can see that these are specific differences to each ethnic group. And even overall, the levels of methylation seem to be very different between the ethnic groups. So Native Hawaiians had around 50% levels of methylation, whites had around 65%, which is much higher. Japanese Americans were somewhere in between. And there was also widespread differences in terms of the variability in methylation in Native Hawaiians, as you can see by this red group where you see different levels of methylation at specific sites in the genome compared to these other ethnic groups. And again, when we look at the principal component analysis, the data here is really striking. We found that not only were there separate clusters of these epigenetic markers, but the variability in the Native Hawaiian population was so different from these other 2 populations. And I know maybe some of you are not familiar with looking at these types of these graphs than I am, so I'm going to try to explain what this means and how important and how interesting this data really is. I'm hoping I can convince you of that. So there are 3 clusters here. You can see that there's the whites are clustering together in their own group in blue. The gray dots are the Japanese Americans that are clustering in their separate group in gray again. But the Native Hawaiian population is clustering separately from the other 2 populations, but you can see in orange, those dots are so widespread. So each individual dot here represents the methylation profile of an individual, and the closer the dots are together or overlapping to each other, the more similar the epigenetic patterns are. The further apart the dots are, the more diverse or divergent those methylation patterns are. So what this is telling us actually is that although these sites are very different between all 3 ethnic groups and they're separating by ethnic groups, the whites and Japanese Americans actually have very similar profiles, epigenetic profiles to each other. That's why they're clustering really tightly together. But Native Hawaiians actually are really widespread and really diverse. So this is really the first time anyone's ever seen this kind of data. This is amazing. Like, we're showing how biologically diverse our community really is compared to others in Hawaii. All right, so what does that mean? How do we understand this data? So we and others are observing the importance of these monocytes in obesity and diabetes. But these cells aren't long-lived in your body. They actually turn over rapidly, every 1 or 2 days. And it comes from hematopoietic stem cells from your bone marrow. I'm not going to go through all the details here. I'm just going to try to get to the point. So we think that altogether, this data means that the monocytes in Native Hawaiians are actually different and behaving differently than other populations. The monocytes that are derived from the hematopoietic stem cells in the Native Hawaiian population seem to be already adopting an inflammatory phenotype that predisposes them towards diabetes based on the epigenetic data, whereas monocytes in whites actually could still be more plastic and capable of adopting a more anti-inflammatory phenotype, whereas in Japanese Americans, there's some phenotypes in the middle. And so we think that this is the first evidence of an epigenetic predisposition to diabetes among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So we're starting to see that there are epigenetic patterns that are ethnic specific, and that there are adverse patterns that associate with inflammation and diabetes. But are these patterns functionally relevant, and are they reversible? So we asked these questions in a pilot study where we partnered with Native Hawaiian serving community-based organizations listed here that facilitate a diabetes self-management intervention that includes social support called Partners in Care. Now, their goal is to help Native Hawaiians living with diabetes to improve their glycemic control using a combination of lifestyle changes, including diet, exercise, education, and social support over a 12-week period. Now, we recruited a small cohort from this study and examined their DNA methylation profiles genome-wide before and after their participation in this 12-week period. And what we observed was actually quite remarkable. We found striking methylation differences in the cells from the same individuals before and after that 12-week period. And in fact, what was really much more remarkable is that the methylation differences in the cells from these individuals actually resembled a more non-diabetic-like state. So in this orange group here, these are non-diabetic individuals' methylation pattern. And in the green group here, these are individuals that are coming after that program was completed. And you can see the methylation patterns are actually quite similar to each other. So the methylation states of individuals that are diabetic after the program are starting to normalize to a non-diabetic-like state. And what's more important, we also found that the inflammatory potential of the cells themselves were actually being modified. They were coming from a highly inflammatory state before the intervention to a less inflammatory state after the intervention. So it was really the lifestyle changes are really having that effect on the epigenome of these cells and its inflammatory potential. Well, we followed the patients through and provided the information back to the community, and just what we found was, and they shared with us real positive experiences from the study and learning about this. I just wanted to recognize them and to share some of the quotes that they provided at the feedback group. Finally, the take-home message I feel from this is that from what we are learning so far is that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are biologically distinct and diverse, so you can't apply guidelines and recommendations around health developed in other populations to Native Hawaiians and expect them to be as effective. And we wouldn't have known this if it weren't for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders participating in these biomedical research studies. So representation of Native Hawaiians in these studies are really critical to better understand how disease develops and how we can best address them and enable prevention in our communities. And so this has allowed us a call to action where we have partnered with community-based organizations like Matt mentioned the other day, Mānoa Organic Farms, which is also family, to engage in these kinds of studies to look at impacts that they have on the health of their individuals. And while we do so, we can understand the biology and how those types of practices might be interacting with the health of those individuals to improve individual health outcomes. And I just want to send a little plug before my time is up, which is I know is soon, for a new study that we're developing. Now we're recruiting a new cohort of individuals that are younger age than the multi-ethnic cohort called the Hawai'i Social Epigenomics of Early Diabetes, or HI-SEED study, where we're recruiting participants from different parts of the islands and throughout Hawaii to look at epigenetic and genome changes in the gut microbiome. We're also looking at interpersonal relationships and the effects of social networks on health behaviors, and we're collecting that information so I can, reach out to me if you're really wanting to know what that data is about. I'm not going to have time to explain this, but we found some really cool associations with clustering of these types of behaviors that associate with health conditions. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but I want to mention one thing briefly is that when we looked at the gut microbiome, we found differences or discrepancies in our population compared to other ethnic groups. So I just wanted to mention that this is all the more reason why we need more our own data to understand better what's really going on in our population. And we can't necessarily apply it to our groups necessarily. And then I just want to make one more plug that we've actually been awarded a new grant by NIH to continue expanding our cohort. We call it the Pacific Ocean Native Observational Health Legacy Study, or PONO, where we just started the study to recruit more individuals into this type of research to better understand and address health disparities. And with that, I'd like to end by saying I think we can better understand and incorporate epigenetics in terms of defining health outcomes, because really the environment does shape and modify our health trajectories through these pathways. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my team here and my supporters and partners, and mahalo nui to all of you for listening. Thank you.